Good evening and welcome. My name's Lynn Cook. I'm the curator at DEAR and organizer of this series with the very able help of Patrick Heilman and Kristen Poor on drums and kettle. I'd like to thank also our patrons, Art for Art's Sake, who've made this possible. And this is a key program for DEAR in Manhattan. Of course, there's still work at changing exhibitions and programming in Beacon, but this program keeps us alive in the city, and it's much appreciated to have their support and the enthusiasm of artists and others who make up the audiences. It's a pleasure to introduce Tom Burr. I first saw his work, as I'm sure many of you may have, through shows he made with Colin Deland at American Fine Arts. First in Soho, and then Colin was one of the pioneers in Chelsea when DEAR opened here in 1987. The first few galleries that came at the beginning of the 90s was spearheaded by Colin and Pat Hearn. And Tom has continued to show in New York and elsewhere since 1992, beginning at White Columns and then showing with Colin in 1993. And many of you, I'm sure, will have seen the show this year at Sculpture Center, or a bigger show in Lausanne in 2006 and show in Vienna at the Secession in 2007. Tom is going to speak on Ryman, and puns intended, I guess. You'll have seen the spelling of the title. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lynn. I just want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I think we're all, I was a little concerned when I realized the date of my talk was just only slightly seconds before a larger event. But I'm hoping that it at best is a distraction from CNN or Fox or whatever your chosen network is. And there are no visuals tonight except what you see before you. And this is very much a read piece. I won't be conversing. And I hope you enjoy it. Ryman. When I was invited to talk in this series about an artist in the DEAR Art Foundation's collection, there were several possible choices which would have been an obvious or direct trajectory, perhaps, with regard to my own things, my own art making. Richard Serra, Donald Judd, and Robert Smithson all would have made perfect sense, I think, particularly as I have questioned, reflected on, referenced, and even copied many of those artists' works over the last several years, hopefully to a more or less pleasurable effect. And being a self-described sculptor myself, choosing an artist from this distinct field was a distinct possibility. The boundaries of these fields do still exist, it seems to me. They've been endlessly challenged and reformulated, deformed and reformed over and over. We either work with them or against them, but they're there to be reckoned with still. They overlap and they blur, these disciplines, and they mix their mediums together. And there are many undecideds among us, but the camps exist, if in a somewhat tattered state. I wrote a poem a couple of years ago called Sculpture in a Constricted Space, which was about some of the poignant and pressing issues that sculptures face today. It was an attempt at object empathy, if not complete object identification. And in rereading it recently, I realized it was largely about Robert Ryman's paintings. I wrote the poem to accompany a series of bent and hinged white plywood sculptures that I've been making during that period of time. They sometimes connected to the wall, sometimes seemingly slinked across the floor, always on the verge of coming undone or flattening out. They're a little like furniture, a little like bodies, a little like paintings. They have titles like Recline, Decline, Collapse, Unhinged, Worn Out, or This Cocktail Party, This Drinking Alone, Christmas Collapse, or The Poet from the Waist Up. I spoke about these works at the time as being derived in part through an adaptation in my head of a scene from Walt Disney's Fantasia, where instead of brooms, buckets, and other overused and abused domestic tools coming to life and dancing around, It was Robert Ryman paintings that, after the museum had been closed for the night, became animated and slipped off the wall and inched, staggered, shuffled, and hopefully danced, most likely to a classic Dizzy Gillespie tune, across the floor. I'll read this brief poem now. Sculpture in a constricted space. Having been bound and tied and buried alive and left for dead or dropped on its head, having been placed in a box, an oblong box, and put in the ground, or under a mound, or put in a room behind a door, or put in a room under the floor, or put on a shelf all by itself, having been bent or propped or cramped, having been spent or cropped or clamped, having been arranged and having been displayed, having been exchanged and having been betrayed, having been slumped and bumped and clumped, having been stumped and lumped and trumped, having been choked, having been poked, having been thought, having been drawn, having been faxed, having been spawned, having been shown, having been known, having been begotten, having been forgotten, having been bought, having been sold, having been yellowed, having been old, having been seen, having been missed, having been entertained, having been dismissed, having been bound and tied and buried alive and left for dead or dropped on its head. Now, I knew when I was invited to talk that I wanted to talk, however randomly and haphazardly, directly or indirectly, and however incompletely, about Robert Ryman's paintings, rather than the work of any of the above-mentioned sculptors in the collection. There's a quality, a stance to Robert Ryman's work that is emphatically about the act of painting and the object called painting. But I can never quite help but think they are objects, called paintings, which possess a certain degree of longing to be more than they are, or to be moved beyond that designation, to be more sculptural, to act as sculptures act, to behave like sculptures behave, to do what sculptures do, at least occasionally. This derives from the shattering of any surface illusion, for sure, and the rejection of pictorial subject matter that is transparently transported by the medium of paint, rejecting the idea of the picture, perhaps, in favor of method and structure and materials. But it is also exhibited in the tendency the works have to slip, or almost slip, or slip if they had the chance, off of the gallery wall. They have weight and girth and volume, and consider and show the effects of force of gravity on themselves. They have gravity. I've always been drawn to them, always felt akin to them somehow, and never felt that they were other in that sense that painting is other to sculpture. These Ryman paintings were always solid objects to me, first and foremost, always forms in the world that negotiated their surroundings or attempted to negotiate their surroundings with eyes wide open and with their feelers out. Ryman's objects are hypersensitive and self-aware inanimate creatures, but they are objects that are very much dependent upon and not at all independent from their surroundings. Like all objects, I guess. But these particular objects acknowledge their dependency and speak about it continually, acknowledging and confessing their very specific issues that they have decided to go public with and to display, acknowledging and confessing the fact that they are in some sense naked in the world and therefore unable to hide or disguise any hidden mechanisms or any hidden agendas beneath their skirts. They're unable or unwilling, perhaps, to mask their means of support and their reliance upon their given context. They are fabulously stubborn structures, liberated by their honesty, but they're not free, which is to say they're not autonomous, which is sometimes the expectation of certain notions of freedom. They are not renegade objects. They are social animals, these objects, embedded within a social fabric. They are paintings that exhibit sculptural tendencies, maybe, or they are sculptures that display painterly affectations. Either way, they are bound and tied, positioned and placed, stapled and fixed. glued, taped, fastened, and screwed. But they are aware of it, and it makes them twitch in a jazzy sort of way. I recently went to Dia Beacon to see the Ryman room again. The works I saw there demonstrate the system of interdependency and connectedness. They seem to require each other's company as much as they require the supporting walls and the floors that they rest upon or are anchored to. They hang together in a peculiar codependent manner. Much has been written about the components of a Robert Ryman painting and the centrality of those physical components in the construction of the work's identity, or the painting's overall makeup, let's say, which is maybe a better term, and a term I like to think about generally, but specifically with regard to Ryman's work, makeup. The various layers of paint and paint-like materials sit on or over a support. The very emphasis on the word support speaks about this interdependency. It could be said that the paint, in a reciprocal gesture, also supports the support. The support, or the understructure, can be many things, various materials, canvas being only the most normal of these. But the support is always connected to a larger support, the wall, the floor, and the room or the space that the wall or the floor is within. The support isn't quietly taking up the rear, but instead is being articulated by the paint, while at the same time, the paint is being articulated by the canvas, or the wood, or the paper, or the plastic. All the elements, all the components are in it together to make something. It's very much a group effort. You know, one of the most extraordinary works in the Dia collection, Burr's Wall, consists of a long, continuous wooden panel that presents itself as a partial section of a wall, standing parallel to the existing gallery wall. The panel sits on top of a series of small pieces of blue foam. These bits of blue keep the wooden panel from directly touching the floor on the one hand, keeping it in place, but also highlight that exact point where the artwork touches, or doesn't touch, or could touch, or won't or will touch the floor. They seem temporary at first glance, as if they were present simply to protect the painting prior to its hanging. But then it's apparent that they have been built into the composition and that they are required. They highlight the place where the panel touches and extends to the surrounding room. They perform like a series of small electrical charges, and in this respect, they play the same role as the bits of tape or the steel hardware brackets that have been used as parts in many of Ryman's work. They utter connectedness and attachedness and underscore this particular moment and location where a painting would traditionally end, finding its bottommost boundary at the lower edge of its canvas or frame. In the case of Burr's Wall, however, these blue electrical charges allow the work to extend in multiple directions, back up the panel's smooth surface and jumping over onto the existing gallery wall, or in the other direction entirely, and skidding across the blonde wood floors of the exhibition room. The chromatic effect of the startling blue is beautiful, breathtaking. The blue foam feet also create a suggestion of incompleteness, less in terms of the work itself and more with regard to its own installation and exhibition. There's the implication that the work has just been lowered off the wall, or that its ascent to the wall is imminent. This electrical spark, enunciated by the blue foam blocks, that startles you into noticing that point of connectivity, then makes me think about further connectivity in the world at large. How far can the painting reach? To think about these objects further, and the question of their reach, and the limits of their frame, I want to contemplate their existence through different settings and scenarios, settings that are both similar to, but also quite remote from, the setting at Dia Art Foundation in Beacon, or numerous other settings where we would typically encounter these things of Robert Ryman. After visiting the Dia Beacon room, some earlier thoughts I'd had about Robert Ryman's work and about artwork in general was further illuminated, further clarified, and thrown into sharper focus. So much so that when I left the building, I felt the entire range of conditions of an object was demonstrated there. The full life cycle of an inanimate object seemed to be articulated within the confines of that space, start to finish. I have a persistent sensation when I visit galleries and museums, a form of claustrophobia, I guess. And this is where that sharp focus begins to blur. I develop a vague anxiety that I will become one of the objects confined to that space, that I will be checked in to the institution against my will. Or worse yet, I might choose to check myself in, elective treatment. Either way, it's hellish, having these inappropriate and peculiar medical fantasies. My object empathy gets the better of me. I, of course, would desire that my own artwork remain in such an institution. That's not the gist of my neuroses. My anxiety is less pragmatic and more visceral, and has much more to do with me and my physical body. I daydream, and the sensation can become mildly destabilizing. My brain drifts, and the gallery of the museum blurs, and then comes into focus again as a clinic or as a hospital. Let's say it's a private hospital, if we're lucky, with long corridors and room after room of private patients in private rooms, each in their own intensely overlit chamber, each with their own white beds surrounded by various metallic medical paraphernalia, medical props and hospital machines for performing medical procedures, bathed in white light, framed by white uniforms and white linens, short-term stays and long-term stays. Some come back, then come back repeatedly. Some don't. Some never come back. Some die. Some stay for extended visits. Some live there. In the Ryman room, there are objects in various states of habilitation, but all of the objects require their various supports and their braces, and they exhibit their dependencies, and they exhibit both their structural strengths and their structural deficiencies. Prosthetic limbs cling to the wall and to the floor. Bodies are bandaged and pieced together and laid open and flat for examination. Surfaces are stabilized and supports are positioned, resting against this wall, propped against that door frame, with various parts stitched and secured. The small pieces of tape that Robert Ryman uses, and used quite frequently in his earlier works, the tape that holds things together, one surface to another, do they ever come loose, I wonder, unhinged? Another mutation of that same fantastical vision, still medically speaking, is the more publicly brutal military hospital, where impromptu carts and transportable beds are lined up in a system of simple triage. Here the Ryman paintings could be lined up within canvas tents. The categorization of the paintings based on the severity of their injuries indicated through the use of printed triage tags or colored flagging. Both means of identification would be entirely consistent with Ryman's own methods of articulating the differences within the samenesses of his paintings. In the simple triage color coding system, there is a highly identifiable means of recognizing the levels of condition. Green indicates a non-serious injury or walking wounded. Yellow, seriously injured, but not immediately life-threatening. Medical attention can be delayed. Red is used to tag the seriously injured in need of immediate medical attention to save life. And black announces the deceased. It's a full spectrum of color and of condition. There are strange bits of color coding that exist in Ryman's paintings. There was that early orange blast of the late 1950s, which Ryman claims as his first professional or mature work, his first exhibitable work. And then after that, he slipped into the more nuanced and subtle ranges of whites, off-whites, near whites, dirty whites, ivories, creams, beiges and grays that we recognize as his palette. I think it's a fantastic way to do it, consciously or not, and possibly only legible in retrospect, but to arrive on the scene with an intense blaze of color and then settle back into a more sober series of decades after that. The bright red dress, or orange in this case, worn to the debut. But within each of these overall conditions of off-white and near-white, there exist myriad other colors and suggestions of color, underlying color and overwashes of color, lending each painting distinction and particularity. Could a Ryman be said to be expressing a condition or state of injury? Can a painting be ill, fractured, or in need of care? It can be broken or damaged, and it can be repaired, restored to its intended state. By showing and articulating its condition of being made, by showing us what it is made of and how it is put together, could the paintings also be demonstrating how they potentially come apart, fall to pieces, and break down? Do they foresee or allow us to foresee their own potential demise? And in this way, are some potentially more drastically debilitated than others? Are some closer to the edge? Photographs of people after they are dead are shocking. If modernity ushered in the camera, it also ushered in the relative impossibility of us to comprehend a dead body, to look at them. They used to lie all around us. We used to lay all around us in our living rooms, and not just hospital rooms. I looked on and off for a long time at the photographs that Annie Leibovitz had taken of Susan Sontag after her death, taken in Campbell's funeral home, I think on Madison Avenue, with a small makeup bag or something located near her feet. Stop motion. All movement stopped. And that lack of movement and the lack of possibility that will ever be movement again only exaggerate what the camera already performs. This is what Roland Barthes wrote about, and this is what Susan Sontag wrote about too. The photographs just several pages before in Leibovitz's book, A Photographer's Life, show Sontag in her private hospital bed at Mount Sinai, falling out of a white dressing gown, surrounded by tubes and dials and clamps and a white orchid. Sontag asleep, awake, being cleaned, being looked at, being photographed by her lover. Somewhere else in the same section of this book is a photograph of Jasper John's studio in Sharon, Connecticut, with the long shadow of a figure, presumably John's, casting across the bare studio floor towards a stool and a painting table. Some paintings don't think about this. Some painters don't either, about the exact moment when the paint dries and the motion stops. I imagine Robert Ryman does. Painters are documents of motion, as well as being a record of that motion's stillness. It's not simply mark making. Now, to ponder the paintings of Ryman, through the lens of the cosmetologist, the beautician, it has occurred to me that the paintings are faces, but faces that are supported and which require additional support and continual support and renewal. Not that I see faces within these squares and rectangles, or that the squares and rectangles represent or mean faces, but that they are countenances themselves, staring back blankly. They hang generally at face height, or if they don't, they self-consciously don't hang at face height, and avoid this intentionally, a face off. We stare at them. They age as objects, but most of us won't see this or read it in the work. Maybe Robert Ryman and certain teams of technicians can see the subtle ravages of time, the hairline cracks and wrinkles, and the slight discolorations that can and will occur over the decades. And those same technicians will spend time renewing these surfaces to their original state long after Ryman can do this himself. But what the paintings are in large part are small resistances to these effects, little acts of defiance against these processes. Age-defying objects, again, self-consciously so. But at the same time, they exhibit that quality of nakedness or transparency that allows you to see how they were made and what they've been through during the process of their being made. And when thought about in this light, some seem more youthful than others, others more senior. They may not appear to age, but they're not all the same age. Edith Sitwell, the 20th century English poet, wrote in her poem titled, "The Poet Laments the Coming of Old Age," "Of the heart, it can never be caught, though I bring back sight to the blind. My seat of folly has gone, that could teach me to bear, that the gold-sinewed body that had the blood of all the earth in its veins has changed to an old rag of the outworn world, and the great heart that the first morning made should wear all time's destruction for a dress. But it is also mark-making and what is put on the canvas that matters. A painter who can hold my attention nearly as long as Ryman can is James Abbott Mcneill Whistler, who is the original proponent of art for art's sake. He's generally considered to be the model for the murdered artist in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is only one reason why he interests me, of course. And then there is the famous trial. But back to the paint. I saw an incredible Whistler once, a huge portrait of a woman called Arrangement in Black and Gray, or Gray and Black. I think it was a late one, where the scheme of the work had largely begun to slip away into squares and rectangles of dark-hued colors, the dress and the figure largely indistinguishable from the areas of background and surrounding tones. There were several paintings titled Arrangement in Black and Gray, or Gray and Black, the most famous being the portrait of his mother. But the titles are all equally brilliant. Symphony in White, No. 2, Harmony in Gray and Green, Variations in Pink and Gray, Nocturne in Blue and Gold, Arrangement in Light Pink and Black, and on and on. Most all of the titles contain a subtitle which acknowledges the person, place, or thing that was being pictorially depicted. But it is clear that this was more or less a secondary concern, perhaps a concession to the fact that, like Warhol, Whistler was a society man, a society painter, and exactly who he was portraying mattered a lot, if not to Whistler, then certainly to the sitter and Whistler's past and future patrons. But as the titles seem to imply, the subject of the paintings had more to do with the illusion of musical score and rhythmic movement and harmonial tone, both to the ear and to the canvas, and this use of the abstraction afforded through another less pictorial art form, music, allowed his paintings to become disengaged from the tangles of painterly tradition. Whistler's approach to portraiture late in life was described by one of his sitters, Arthur J. Eddy, who posed for the artist in 1894. I like this passage. It de-emphasizes the pictorial subject of the painting while emphasizing the process of painting as an overall method, and at the same time alludes to the physical and chemical process of developing a photograph. I quote, "He worked with great rapidity and for long hours, but he used his colors thin and covered the canvas with innumerable coats of paint. The colors increased in depth and intensity as the work progressed. At first, the entire figure was painted in grayish-brown tones, with very little flesh color, the whole blending perfectly with the grayish-brown of the prepared canvas. Then the entire background would be intensified a little, then the figure made a little stronger, then the background, and so on and so forth, from day to day, and week to week, and often from month to month. And so the portrait would really grow, really develop as an entirety, very much as a negative under the action of the chemicals grows out gradually, light, shadows, and from the very first faint indications to their full values. It was as if the portrait were hidden within the canvas, and the master, by passing his wands day after day over the surface, evoked the image." End quote. Another element of Whistler's work, which is reflected in Ryman's practice as well, is the presence and treatment of his signature in his work. Whistler's famous butterfly signature was first developed in the 1860s, emerging out of his interest in Asian art. Whistler collected china and would study the potter's marks on the china and then decided to design a monogram of his own initials to incorporate into his paintings. Eventually, this evolved into the shape of an abstract butterfly. Later, he added a stinger to the butterfly image to create a mark representing both his gentle, sensitive nature and his more toxic side. The butterfly signature was always carefully designed and worked into the whole of the composition, considered from the outset to be an integral component of the painting. Robert Ryman's works from the late 1950s are beautifully seductive examples of this practice, where the name R. Ryman and the date 58, or 57, or 59 are seen clearly against the raw canvas in one instance, or camouflaged within the body of paint in another, or as the main compositional element in yet another. There's a stylization to the letters. They are self-consciously transcribed in paint or pencil with no pretense of naturalization or of immediacy. Nor are they in any way an afterthought or mark of completion. They are part of the object, as all signatures can be said to be, I guess. But they are compositionally and conceptually as central to the paintings as the gobs of paint or streaks of graphite that they are created with. But unlike the butterfly of Whistler, which was emblematic and symbolic in its suggestions and applied repeatedly across many of the different painting surfaces without changing its form, the forms that our Ryman would and could take are myriad and determined not ahead of time and not at all after the fact, but through the same process as the rest of the object was determined. It was generated at the same time and as part of the same simultaneous gesture. But to return to the cosmetic realm for a minute and the questions of paintings as age-defying objects, paint, it seems to me, is more akin to makeup than to the skin it is often likened to, or some fusion of the two perhaps, especially in Ryman's work. It can be elegantly and efficiently applied, or not, with a brush, or the beautician's wand, to define, enhance, or disguise the structure beneath it. Specifically, I think of base, or foundation makeup, which is applied to the skin to create a new ground to build upon. Estee Lauder's palette goes something like this: alabaster, porcelain, warm ivory, sand, warm sand, beige, warm beige, natural, warm natural, honey, golden, warm almond, almond, warm walnut, walnut, chestnut, and espresso. Or at Winsor and Newton, it might go more like this: iridescent white, flake white number 1, flake white hue, foundation white, titanium white, transparent white, underpainting white, zinc white, and possibly Payne's gray, Davies gray, charcoal gray, blue black, lamp black, Mars black, and a favorite of mine, Mars violet deep. There are various settings for the application of makeup, where the act of applying the makeup itself can be performed, both architecturally configured and determined spaces, and more fleeting in-between moments. A room with a stool and a vanity, the bathroom mirror, or an elevator or a car in a handheld compact. A salon with many chairs and mirrors all in a row, where technicians hover over faces waiting for the technicians to brush on the first layer of their new skin, their new surface coating. Portraits and self-portraits created in studios for the face, in shades of whites, tans, beiges and browns, and large buckets of Dorian gray. Applying, removing, applying again, removing again, etc., etc., etc. Ryman's work, Verree's wall, the wall panel that rests on the 5 blue foam blocks that I spoke about earlier, is repainted each time it is reinstalled with a fresh layer of vinyl acetate. This gesture gathers the support walls of the exhibition space into the frame of the painting, in a sense, by submitting the painting to the same regime of installation as the surrounding exhibition hall itself. It is produced again, created afresh, application on top of application on top of application, accumulating onto the surface and becoming the surface, building a potentially endless template of time and exhibition. With makeup, there is no picture, just the aspiration to become as pretty as one. But instead of a picture, there is support and application and coverage and completed surface. Femininity, I suppose. Masculinity, maybe too. Passive planes to be pondered, appreciated, judged, and selected. Makeup is about illusion sometimes, enhancement most of the time, and some ancient notion of decoration. It's about both pleasure and anxiety. To take the paintings of Robert Ryman at face value is to see and to read the materials you find yourself staring at just the way they are. What attaches something to something else, braces, tacks, or tape, is part of the connective tissue and is on equal footing and receives equal billing with the canvas, wood, panels, and paint, an artist's signature. There's a sort of democracy of material composition, with the sides, the edges, the back, the front, the adjacent wall, the wall down the hall, etc., all being lit in the same manner and with the same intensity. In speaking about Untitled, 1958, Ryman says, quote, "The importance given to the sides of the painting had to do with the feeling that always in painting you're confined to the space of the canvas. And of course, in traditional painting, you're confined to the very front space because of its being a picture. I felt that, this not necessarily being a picture, the painting did not necessarily have to be confined to the front plane," end quote. There are no illusions to this. There are no false hopes. To look for other meaning, as Ryman has stated, is to look for faces in the clouds. But like a nervous tick, I find myself thinking about them not so much in terms of meaning or what the intention of the work might be, but in terms of their place in the world at large, my small world at large. What they remind me of is important to me. Where my mind drifts to when looking or thinking about the works is important to me. The contingency of the moment of viewing. And in the same breath, at what points in time do thoughts of Ryman paintings intrude into my brain and into the context of my day? What architecture, what built environments, what rooms, what other paintings, what sculptures, what bodies, what sounds, what bad memories, and what moments of bliss. These are all of those parts of the paintings that are just beyond the walls of the exhibition space. And what conditions of pleasure and anxiety they conjure up are part of that extension as well. Once again, I'm thinking of Verrees' Wall, which according to Anne Rorimer's Dia collection essay takes its title from the walls, quote, "the walls that lead to the villa of Count Panza di Buomo in Verrees, Italy," end quote. A reference to walls, walls that lead to a home that has been an historic host to art, located at a great distance from where the work finds itself installed. Put another way, how do Ryman paintings function when they are hung in a domestic setting? When they're not installed and viewed in the setting of a museum or a gallery, where either the artist himself or museum technicians can define the immediate surroundings of the painting and calibrate it accordingly. I've read many essays about the Ryman painting and its relationship to the gallery or museum, but I can only imagine that there are many instances when Ryman himself has overseen the hanging of a work, or the leaning, or the propping, or the bracing of a work in a private collection. Like the painting inscribed, quote, "To Gertrude Mellon," for instance, or the above-mentioned Count. Ryman may have overseen or collaborated on this painting's placement, but I don't know about that personally. How far would the project reach? Where would the frame begin and end in these instances? Would it be an elastic, expansive condition, or would the painting be torn out, in a sense, of one context and inserted into another, creating a rupture both to the painting and to the room where the painting hangs, a cut and paste, a dislocation, a non-site of sorts? An ambassador sent out into the world to represent the community of Rymans located elsewhere in a larger, more complete constellation. Do the paintings have it in them to adjust to different, less so-called neutralized environments, or would the environments adjust to the paintings? Take my living room as an example. It's not an easy room for a Ryman to hang in, let alone lean or prop in, but it's a room where I would love to see a Ryman in. The house is in the countryside and was built as a simple farmhouse in 1895. It has been renovated. What were once 3 small rooms is now 1 larger room, although it's not a big room still. It has 7 windows and 1 glass door leading out to a porch. and the room surrounds a central volume of horizontal wood that encloses the fireplace. 2 walls have bookcases floor to ceiling. There are Ryman books on one of those shelves, and Whistler books, and Sontag books, and the Edith Sitwell book of the poems I quoted from earlier, and Annie Leibovitz's A Photographer's Life. The room is painted white right now. I've been considering off-white or gray. The furniture is a mixture of things: 2 brown leather Florence Knoll chairs on top of a threadbare brownish Persian carpet, a camelback couch, George Nelson kite lamps, 1 tall, 1 squat, 2 old oak coffin stands, various framed things on the walls, including work of mine, and a photograph of Yvonne Rainer in Cape Cod taken by Babette Mangold in 1972. It doesn't leave a lot of space for my Ryman, but what space there is inhabited, and there would be a great deal of visual and informational competition within the setting. But I could still imagine it working. This is what I might do. I would strip the longest wall of its contents, with the notable exception of a circa 1960 Tony Paul small rolling bar cart, which is now called Brown Bar due to the numerous whiskeys and bourbons that are housed there. Yves Lambois has written of Ryman that he, quote, allows us the pleasure of intoxication, end quote. And I can think of no better pairing than an off-white Ryman suspended over my rolling brown bar cart. The wall itself has 2 evenly spaced double-hung windows, 2 over 2, fairly large, with dark green, close to black, canvas pull shades. The painting would be installed directly over the bar, which is the very center of the wall. There would be a corresponding window on either side. The very good thing about this space is that the painting would expand its frame to include the entire wall, including the 2 windows and the bar. When the window shades are up, the view of the surrounding fields enters the equation. And then when they're pulled, long dark canvas rectangles would flank the artwork. The exact location where the painting would hang is directly across from one end side of the fireplace volume, creating a small isolated passage where a fairly close encounter with the painting and with the brown bar could take place, as well as drawing the fireplace volume into the frame. I think it would work. And in the background, salt peanuts, 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 salt peanuts. Charles Wiley wrote in his essay that accompanied an exhibition of Ryman work at the Dallas Museum of Art, quote, one can certainly detect similarities or trace any number of artists' works in Robert Ryman paintings, yet never arrive at a satisfactory set of parallels, because he has taken an entirely independent route in his chosen field. One hesitates to say that he is a maverick, as that implies a sense of actively contrary, sometimes subversive will, and Ryman is nothing if not a superhumanly deliberate practitioner of the art of painting, end quote. Now, since this is a word, maverick, with which I was only partially acquainted with until recently, I decided to explore its meanings. It derives from the Texas pioneer and cattleman, Samuel A. Maverick, 1803 to 1870, who left his calves unbranded. The term was and is still used to describe an unbranded range animal, especially a calf that has become separated from its mother, traditionally considered the property of the first person who brands it. It's now used to describe a, quote, lone dissenter, such as an intellectual, an artist, or a politician, who takes an independent stand apart from his or her associates, end quote. But if you take both of these usages together, even that, quote, intellectual, artist, or politician, which is a very curious triangle of figures, I think, that figure is still branded in the end. We're all branded in the end. It is also, by the way, the name of an electro-optically guided U.S. air-to-ground tactile missile for destroying tanks and other hardened targets at ranges up to 15 miles. Robert Ryman may or may not be a maverick in any of these senses. His own branding and that of his calves is his own personal business, I think. But I would steadfastly say that his herd of objects remain very much articulated through their constraints as well as through their connective tissue to the world. They form and reflect a social order and are part of a social situation and describe for me a set of conditions through which all objects, and I'll extend that to all subjects, are filtered. They are bound and tied, positioned and placed, stapled and fixed. They are glued, taped, fastened and screwed, like we all are, but we're aware of it, and it makes us twitch in a jazzy sort of way. Thank you. Any questions?
Can I ask you a question about humor?
Humor.
Which the lecture could be described in some senses as a conceit, in like the way John Donne uses this term, the conceit. Which has a sense of wit to it in the appropriateness of the metaphors. But I often see humor in Ryman's work, in the work itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how much you do, and whether that generated the framing metaphor you've given the talk, or whether it's a separate thing.
No, absolutely. I think that's why I wanted to first call the piece Ryman, because I wanted to be unclear who was the Ryman. And I'd always felt that with Robert Ryman's work. I saw him in 1985 at in Pittsburgh, describing his work at the International when I was working for an artist as a young person. And Jenny Holzer was also there giving a talk. And Jenny described in a very politicized and very specific way her work at that time. And Robert Ryman wasn't the work we were thinking about at that time. But he stood there, and I know this is very classic, and many of you probably heard it, but I had not heard him talk about his work before. And he stood there and he simply described every exact piece of paint and detail that you saw in front of him for about 45 minutes, much longer than I could. And people just started to twitch and move around and wanted something more. And that combined with those marvelous glasses, I mean, there was incredible humor in it. And then that was confirmed later on when I purchased that book, package that Ryman had made for children or adults to make their own Ryman. And it's this wonderful book that has a how-to, I think it even comes with Winsor & Newton paints, some of which I mentioned here. And he kind of debunks the whole mysticism of what it is to produce a minimalist painting, and tells you how to do it step by step by step. And so he already because in a way, Robert Ryman is the quintessential New Yorker cartoon in a certain sense that we grew up with, of the blank canvas on the wall and so many bad jokes are made about that sort of thing. But I saw it in the work, and I approached my work that way, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to make that connection. I certainly didn't want to simply write or say something humorous about someone that I didn't think was already sort of evoking that, if that answers, maybe. Any other questions?
Well, I guess this is consistent with that, because humor, that's the kind of humor that I also find in Samuel Beckett. And indeed, Beckett liked Ryman's work very much, and they collaborated on a book. So that it's humor, but it's a particular kind of humor.
Yeah, I mean, the only way I can talk about pictures of, Susan Sontag being dead is also then pulled back and forth that way. So I think to get at things in a very, very serious fashion, it's much more interesting to sometimes slip in and out of that. And I also loved the notion of thinking about black humor in relationship to someone who makes white paintings. It's just so black and white. But with Beckett, I guess I would think about the absurd. And I think there's something about the absurd with Mrs. Ackerman.
I wanted to ask what kind of Ryman you would choose.
Well, I was sort of, this wasn't a pitch to get one, but it did occur to me that if I was really earnest about it, I did notice in the catalog raisonné that many of the pictures did say collection of the artist. So I thought, you never know. I really love the early ones that are almost about to disintegrate. They seem like they're paper on top of paper that are taped. And these are the ones that they become somewhat more industrial later on, I think. And maybe my chronology is not exactly correct because maybe these things overlap. But and I talked a bit about this, but these are earnest questions about tape and fastenings and fabric and things and stabilizing these things. And they do make me think when I'm in front of them about my own aging and my own, my clothing aging, my skin aging. And I think there's something interesting about them being kind of stabilized. So I'd like one of those very early ones that it's just about to decay.
Can you help me out with the Salt Peanuts?
Salt Peanuts. Dizzy Gillespie. Well, I thought it's, that's why I also brought in Whistler as well, because everything you read about Ryman and everything I've ever thought about Ryman was that he made a very clear decision at a certain point in his life not to be a jazz musician, specifically with regard to bebop. And you already know this, though. And so I wanted there to be that, and in this children's book and in other places, he says that for him, painting is like music. And one of the particular things he liked about this form of jazz was that it was, and one of the reasons I wanted to read something very structured is that Ryman very much considered the kind of jazz that he was interested in the mid to late 50s as not the improvisational jazz, but the highly structured jazz, the highly structured harmonies and riffs and motifs. And that seems consistent with his practice. And you don't find a lot of lyrics in bebop music, so rather than turning it on, which was the other idea, and I thought that's sort of been done a lot, I thought I would find the only lyrics I could in bebop, and I think the only lyrics are Salt Peanuts. It's this Dizzy Gillespie song where he puts this trumpet up and down. Are we good?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.